Some lifters go into the gym focused on hitting a PR every session, while others focus on getting as much volume in as possible. Who's right? Well, I have a lot to say on this, but stay tuned until the end because after we discuss the research, I'll sum it all up into a few practical points. Let's start off by describing two archetypes of lifters. On one hand, some lifters emphasize strength gain for muscle growth, claiming that as long as you're getting stronger, you're going to get bigger. We're going to call these people the PR chasers. On the other hand, some lifters focus more on input variables, probably most commonly training volume. We're going to call these people the volume chasers. Let's discuss the pros and cons of each, starting with the PR chaser. First pro is that PR chasers will more quickly detect a program that isn't working. Let me explain. So to maximize muscle growth, it is necessary to see detectable progress over time. While I do think that many lifters overemphasize strength or performance gain in the gym, our position is that strength gain is necessary but not sufficient for muscle growth. As a result, we're pretty big on monitoring progress not only for power lifters, who we coach a lot of, but also for lifters primarily interested in hypertrophy, who we also coach. So, while the PR chaser may slightly overemphasize performance, they will definitely be quick to notice when they aren't progressing, and as a result, they'll be able to make the appropriate program changes. Now, the second main pro of the PR chaser is that a focus on performance, typically by keeping a detailed training log, ensures that proximity to failure, or the accuracy of your RPE/RER ratings, is dialed in. In my experience, if you have no idea what a quote-unquote good set is on an exercise for you, you're more likely to call something, say, 2 reps in reserve, when you actually have much more in the tank, especially on days when motivation to train is low. But if you're constantly looking to set PRs, you'll be more likely to find a way to get the most out of each session. Now, that actually leads us directly into our first con of the PR chaser, which is that the PR chaser may train too close to failure early in a session. While we don't have direct evidence on this topic, I think there's some good rationale and hints in the research. From the best meta-analysis on the topic, it seems that in relatively low volume programs, training to failure will lead to better muscle growth. However, a recent study by Ruffalo and colleagues used higher volumes, in the range of 10 to 17 sets per week, depending on the participant, which is close to double of what many of the studies in the mentioned meta-analysis used. In this Ruffalo study, they compared training with 1 to 2 reps in reserve to failure training, and the results suggested very similar hypertrophy in the quads. So, training to failure right away in a session may cause a good amount of fatigue for the rest of the session. This could ultimately result in a drop-off in stimulus for later sets, which is of course important to consider when training with those higher volumes. This is actually reflected nicely in some of the training data reported by the authors. So while the failure condition did more reps earlier in sets simply because they're training to failure, they also saw a greater drop-off in rep performance from set to set due to fatigue. The authors reported the average number of reps in each session, and it was similar in each condition. So it may be that the failure training was more productive in isolation, but the net stimulus of later sets decreased to some degree, ultimately leading to similar hypertrophy to training with 1 to 2 reps in reserve. So the point is, in most cases, I think it makes sense to leave some reps in the tank early in sessions, which the PR chaser may fail to do. Our second con of the PR chaser is taking too long of rest periods. We actually have some content on rest periods planned that might surprise you, so make sure you're subscribed. But what I will say for now is based on a new meta-analysis by Singer, you can see that their analysis didn't show a clear additional benefit of rest periods beyond about 2 minutes. So while a decent bit of rest is probably important to bring a lot of focus and intent to the next set, that doesn't mean we need to be resting, say, 5 to 7 minutes between all of our sets for muscle growth. This is time that the PR chaser could be spending doing more volume or just getting out of the gym and getting on with their day. And ultimately, that leads into our final con of the PR chaser, which is failing to get in additional volume they otherwise could if they weren't so fixated on performance. All right, now let's move on to the pros and cons of the volume chaser. The first pro of the volume chaser is obvious. They get in adequate volume. In most volume studies, additional sets do lead to more growth, so if you can tolerate it, it's probably smart to get the additional work in. This is even if you can't perform extremely well on those later sets, which is something the PR chaser would hate. In fact, this is demonstrated really nicely in the drop set research, which consists of immediately dropping the load after failing a set and performing one or multiple additional drop sets. The most recent meta-analysis in this area by Coleman reported no clear difference between straight sets and drop sets. Now, things get a little bit complicated when you get into the weeds with the drop set research, but our analysis of this research is that drop sets are in the ballpark of 50 to 75% as effective as a regular set, providing us a proof of concept that additional volume can be stimulative even if you're not hitting PRs on those sets. And that leads us into the second pro of the volume chaser, and that is that they don't overly worry about performance. As we mentioned, it's good to be generally mindful of performance, but there's a point of becoming too fixated on it. Fatigue from outside of the gym or training fatigue from recent sessions can mask your performance, but there's no evidence I'm aware of that this completely masks your ability to elicit a robust hypertrophy stimulus. At the same time though, there's obviously a balance to be struck here, and this leads us to our first con of the volume chaser. If we aren't at all mindful of performance, the volume chaser may fail to detect a program that isn't working. As I mentioned before, a lack of progress in the gym over multiple months can indicate that changes need to be made, but the volume chaser may miss this. Now, our second con of the volume chaser is that they may rest too little. While we don't need to rest, say, 5+ minutes, we shouldn't use very short rest periods all the time, as that will compromise performance dramatically throughout a session. Again, performance drop-off is generally fine, and sets under fatigue are still stimulative, but if the volume chaser is using short rest for most of their training, it'll be hard to maximize the stimulus of the entire session. Lastly, the volume chaser may sandbag their sets, or in other words, train quite far from failure and fail to push themselves. This can be caused by not being aware of their previous weights and reps on each exercise, and as a result, volume chasers may be prone to sessions that aren't as stimulative as they could be, especially on days where motivation to train is low. So, as you can see, a lot of the mentioned variables are a double-edged sword, and we should generally look to find a reasonable balance between the characteristics of the volume chaser and the PR chaser. We should simultaneously be cognizant of progression, but also ensure we're prioritizing the total stimulus of a given session. So let's go ahead and wrap up with some quick takeaways. Our first takeaway is to track your training and look to hit PRs over time, at least for a few movements. This will give you insight into whether your program is working, and also keep yourself honest to push yourself on days with lower motivation. Second, rest sufficiently to perform well for most sets, but avoid resting so long that it significantly takes away from your total volume. And lastly, consider adding some rest pause or drop set training at the end of sessions. These sets in isolation are likely less effective than regular sets, but if they don't cause recovery issues, there's little reason to tack them on because they're so time efficient. All right, that's it. Thank you for tuning in. Please check out the description for our coaching and programs. We have a great product called Infinity Programs that creates a program based on your goals and your time availability, helps you track your progression, and most importantly, helps you make adjustment based on your progress so your programming only improves over time. Please make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you in the next one.